All right, and we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel, Rejecting Reform. I'm your host, Asia Arnold, independent journalist, activist, and some of you may know me as the founding editor of Mainline Magazine based in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm very excited to be joined today by Devin Barrington-Ward, also from Atlanta and from the Movement for Black Lives and the Black Futurists group in Atlanta, as well as renowned author and academic Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing. Thank you both for being here with us tonight.
You bet.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, being the reporter that I am, I have to share we just learned some breaking news in Atlanta. It's been a pretty hectic day at the Georgia General Assembly. One bill concerning policing, the anti-defund police bill, HB 286, was passed the Senate today. A voter suppression bill also made its way through the General Assembly. And we just learned that one of our own representatives, Representative Park Cannon, has been detained by Highway Patrol Police at the Capitol. Is that right, Devin? Yeah. So we have a lot to talk about. I'm excited to draw some of these broader concepts that Alex writes in his book and talk to Devin about his personal experience and really pull them in on the ground and how it affects us in Atlanta directly in our communities, because I think we are in the limelight for a lot of these discussions. So my first question is for Alex. In your book, you write, "The police do not prevent crime. This is one of the best kept secrets of modern life. Experts know it, the police know it, but the police do not know it, but the public does not know it." I apologize. Yet the police pretend that they are society's best defense against crime and continually argue that if they are given more resources, especially personnel, they will be able to protect communities against crime. This is a myth. My question for you is, how does this myth continue to gain prominence in American belief, and what is our best shot at dispelling that myth?
Well, thanks for that. There's a great video by the organization Project NIA, N-I-A, and called Defund the Police. And in it, they point out that for most people who are white, middle class, better off, policing is something that they see on television. That the vast majority of them have no direct interaction with police beyond possibly a parking ticket or a traffic ticket. And that what people know about policing is what they see either on the nightly news or even more likely what they see on crime television shows. The nightly news has this ethos of if it bleeds, it leads. And if it's a problem of crime, it's something for the police to handle. And there's really very little nuance to that. And so the nightly news exaggerates the amount of crime and exaggerates the centrality of policing as the only possible tool that could be used to deal with public safety issues. Television dramas, movies are in a sense even worse, especially the reality shows like Cops and Live PD and America's Most Wanted. They dramatically overemphasize the amount of violence and serious crime. They make it seem like there's a serial killer behind every bush, that there are bank robbers on every street corner, and that young people are members of international drug cartels, in communities of color, right? These are the stereotypes that we see, and that police are the heroes. That police are the ones who solve our problems. The police are the ones that produce safety for us. And there's never any exploration of either the ways in which police are harmful or the possibilities of non-police-based strategies for making our communities safer and healthier places. And so that perpetuates this myth, especially for the most politically powerful people in our society. Middle class and upper class white people. For Black and brown people, for immigrants, for homeless folks, they know policing in a completely different way. They see firsthand the harms of policing, but they don't have the political power to shape these conversations, except in the midst of the kinds of movements we've seen in recent years, which have at least forced people to start having a more public conversation about this disconnect between what we think police do and what police actually do.
Great, thank you for that response. And Devin, I want to kick this question over to you, but let me first I want to thank you for your activism on the ground in our communities in Atlanta. With that news of Park, I know that you yourself have been detained by Highway Patrol, as you were sharing. I know that you have been in the crossfires, being on the ground in the Capitol, specifically in 2018, protesting voter suppression legislation, which we're seeing an unprecedented backlash from Georgia Republicans in response to our blue wave and our record-breaking turnout last year. So taking what Alex just shared, how are you feeling about all this is playing out in real time right now? Like, how are you feeling right now? And what can you add to this myth of policing and what you've seen play out on the ground in Atlanta and in your own experience?
Well, thank you for having me here. I think it's important that we have conversations that bring in the scholarly aspect of why policing in America and in our communities is dangerous for many of the communities that oftentimes we claim that policing is there to assist. But I also think it's important that we have the experiences, the lived experiences of people who've been harmed by the criminal legal system. And that harm, I can trace that back to when I saw my father as a 5-year-old beat up by the DeKalb County Police in South DeKalb Mall while I was trying to get fitted for glasses at an optometry store. And so when I think about these experiences and how my grandmother in the 60s could talk about seeing police used to quell protests around voting rights, and then in 2018 and 2021 consider used in this way to suppress the voices of people who are standing up. I'm not sure if I'm muted or not.
Hey, Devin, I'm sorry. Your audio is spotty a little bit there. Let's see if we can get that corrected.
Okay, let's see. Is that a little bit better?
It's sounding better now. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. So what I will say is that I think, dating back to my experience seeing my father beat up by the DeKalb County Police when I was a young child trying to get glasses, to being arrested in the state capitol, a building that I had worked in since I was 16 years old, when I started, working on campaigns with Stacey Abrams when she first started running for office in 2006. I've seen how law enforcement is used to quell the voices of people of color, quell the voices of Black people who are standing up for dignity and the right to exist. And how oftentimes the only time we see a real investment of public dollars into Black and brown communities, it's usually an investment that goes through the carceral state, so the police department, through courts and jails. And we don't see investments in our communities that really address the material conditions of the people who are experiencing this lack of safety in community. We know what causes people to be unsafe. When people are not seen as full human beings by their government, that is an avenue to be unsafe. When people don't have housing, that is an avenue for people to be unsafe. That when people don't have the resources, the financial resources needed to provide and take care of themselves, we know that are predictors for whether or not someone is going to be in a safe situation or not. And so we have to get real about the fact that we continue to spend upwards to $215 million on policing in Atlanta. And many of the communities, whether it be Black or brown or even white folks, continue to say that we don't feel safe. And so one must ask, if we continue to double down this $215 million in the city of Atlanta on the police, and more broadly in Georgia, over $8 billion that's spent on police, prisons, and jails throughout the state of Georgia, and people are still not saying that we're safe, then we have to really get to the reality of the situation, which is that policing is not the answer for public safety. Addressing these long-term systemic issues around housing, issues around wealth opportunities, issues around health, and access to housing and other things that help actualize people are the things that are going to keep our folks safe. Public safety doesn't start with the police, but it starts with people. And I think a lot of the leaders in Atlanta have forgotten that. And so we see how there's a direct connection between many of the bills that are doubling down on law enforcement, but also the connection between these bills that are also doubling down on taking away people's freedoms away. And we cannot unlink the two.
Great, thank you. I want to fast forward to bring us to the wake of George Floyd on May 25th of last year, and Atlanta's protest started on May 29th. Devin, I'm going to let you speak to what Atlanta's response was, despite what I think a lot of public opinion is about the city of Atlanta and how we responded to that. But Alex, I want to turn to you and ask you, last summer, I caught you on a podcast. You did a lot of panels last summer, I know, because this policing and public safety was coming up in conversation in a way I don't think we've ever seen. Defund the police was used a lot, and I think very misinterpreted in the news for multiple reasons. But you were on the Columbia Journalism Review, the Kicker podcast hosted by Kyle Pope, along with Josie Duffy Rice of The Appeal and author Michael Denzel Smith, in a roundtable discussion about last year's uprisings. You all expressed that you were impressed with the amount of airtime you were given to break down the tenets behind abolitionist movements, particularly in regards to defunding police. So here we are now, coming up on a year after the death of George Floyd, months after the election, new administration, but very much the same issues. How do you feel about the defund police movement, how it went, and the media coverage as the year went on further into the election?
Great. So, part of what I was trying to communicate in that roundtable was just how unusual it was that for this brief moment, there was this opening in the mainstream media to talk about these very transformative ideas, and that these ideas were not new. These movements were not new. They had been percolating in cities across the country without any media coverage. And then because of the intensity and the breadth of the protests, there was an opening for serious discussion in the mainstream media about these ideas, even though it was often with a dismissive kind of tone in many cases. Since that opening in the summer, there was a very quick retrenchment. I think that most of the mainstream media thought that this movement was going to hurt Biden and the Democrats. And so there was an effort to sideline it, to sideline the conversation. And now that the election is over, I think there's a little bit more of an opening, but there is still a retrenchment around Biden's much more conservative agenda. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that gives more money to police, and Biden's hirings at the Justice Department that want to give more money to the police, and a broad kind of rejection of the defund the police movement. The good news is that these movements continue to do hard work in the neighborhoods of raising these issues, of pressing the demands. And so there continues to be local news coverage and some national news coverage, in part because people are winning things. In Austin, money out of the police budget to pay for supportive housing. In Oakland, shutting down the school police and replacing them with counselors and other services. In Denver and lots of other cities, Portland, New York, Los Angeles, creating community-based crisis response teams. So those victories continue to propel the media coverage. And I think that I'm less optimistic about what's happening at the national level, but these local victories, I think, are going to create a kind of grassroots momentum that I hope eventually will percolate up more into the national conversation.
Thank you. And Devin, how did you feel about the media coverage and conversations, whether that be national or even local, like the AJC in Atlanta, revolving around defunding police?
Yeah, I think that it has been intentionally misinterpreted and I think that there was an opportunity to define it early on, and I think and I'll take some responsibility as a movement builder and an organizer on the ground, that we could have done a better job defining what it meant to defund the police from early
Devin,
on.
I'm sorry.
Are we having audio again?
Yeah, apologies for the.
Are we having audio issues again?
Yeah, but as soon as I say something about it, it's like it fixes itself. It's very weird.
But maybe if you turn your
Okay.
camera off
Are we
for a
good
second,
now?
maybe if you turn your camera off for a
All right.
second, it'll reduce the bandwidth.
Or try and give
better
us
now?
other thoughts again. Yeah, it is working now. I think we needed to
Okay,
say.
great. So yeah, I think that we could have done a better job of defining what it meant to defund police. I think that we needed to do a better job of anticipating that the mainstream media was going to misinterpret it, and that also the Republicans were going to take it as an opportunity to try and bash Democratic candidates, who oftentimes many of the Democrats who were running it. And there was this, misnomer that Democrats lost seats in Congress because of defund, and none of the candidates who lost seats in Congress had actually even embraced defund, and many of them who lost their seats in Congress were folks who didn't support the expansion of Medicaid or Medicaid for all, and so wrongly, defund the police was made as a scapegoat for why Democrats were not as competitive as they could have been in some of the other elections nationally and locally. But what I was excited to see was legislation that moved forward in various cities like New York. The Reimagine LA ballot initiative was successful in diverting, $300 million towards community issues and concerns in favor of that, instead of seeing that money invested into police and jails. And even here in Georgia, here in Atlanta, a campaign that I'm proud to be a part of to close the Atlanta City Detention Center was successful in being able to divert some of the funding that was allocated towards the city detention center and have that money reallocated towards policing alternatives diversion initiatives, formerly known as the Atlanta Fulton Pre-Arrest Diversion Initiative. And so that is an initiative that places counselors and therapists and caseworkers on our streets rather than more police officers to divert people from having to be engaged in the criminal legal system. And so I was excited to see that we also had the Rayshard Brooks bill, which would have drastically reimagined the Atlanta City Police Department's budget, so that we could see a budget that really reflects the needs of people and not the needs of carceral institutions. So that way we could get to the root causes of what caused our communities to be unsafe in the first place. But unfortunately, that legislation did not pass by one vote. And so we were so close yet so far. But I think it's an important issue that's going to shape a lot of the city elections this year here in 2021 around the mayor and the city council seats that are going to be up for re-election.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work lies in the local elections that we're going to see this year, because the current iteration, and there's a question I want to ask on the importance of local government as well as activists for Alex in a second. But just to pull on what Devin just shared, I think the current iteration of city council in Atlanta as it stands is not going to see this through. And I'll ask more about that. But since we're talking about defunding police, this panel is about rejecting reform, right? Which means I think for me personally, we shouldn't be shy around the fact that we are talking about revolution, not reform in social movement today. Do you consider defunding police a tenet of abolition or more of a reform? Alex, why don't you take that one?
So I don't think there's anything about the defund the police movement that is inconsistent with a broader vision of abolition. But defund the police by itself isn't necessarily the full realization of that. but I think it's a step that could lead in that direction. And my experience traveling around the country working with folks on the ground is that even folks who think of themselves fully as abolitionists do not imagine a scenario where tomorrow we flip some magical switch and then all police just disappear and then we figure it out, right? Everyone understands that A, that's not possible, and B, what we're trying to do is replace policing with better strategies. And that takes time. And so what the defund police movement is saying is these are the concrete steps we could take right now to begin to reduce, chip away at, shrink our reliance on policing. And then the question is, well, where does that end? What's the end goal of that? In my mind, that's an open question. We don't know what the end goal of that is. We know we don't need police in schools. We know we don't need police in the drug business. We know we don't need police chasing homeless people around intersections. We know we don't need police going on mental health crisis calls. We need to get police out of the sex work business. We need to get them out of the gang suppression business. What's left after that? Well, it turns out not very much. And then we can talk about what to do about that and try to figure out whether or not we can develop something to reduce our need for policing to do those things as well. So I think the defund police movement is very clear that it's not just about canceling police. It's about building up alternative strategies of public safety. And that's very much what the police abolition and prison abolition movements have always been about.
And Devin, same question for you in terms of defunding police. Do you view it as an abolitionist tenet or a form of reform?
It's definitely an abolitionist tenet. First, can people hear me? Are we good? Okay. Yes, it is definitely a tenet of abolition.
I can't hear you that well. I can't hear you that well.
Yeah,
Can others? I don't. Can you try it with the camera off for a few minutes and see if that fixes it?
Hello? How's that now?
Yeah,
a little better.
A little better? Okay. That's interesting. I'm the only person on the internet in my house unless my dog is using the Wi-Fi. Okay, well, I'll answer the question without my lovely face on camera. With that being said, I do think that it is a tenet of abolition, but it is not the full kit and caboodle. And so when I say that abolition is not just about what you are getting rid of, it's also what you're talking about putting in place, right? So abolition oftentimes is framed in the very traditional media as it's just about getting rid of things, but abolition is also about building new things. And so when we're talking about the full vision for abolition, it is reducing the scope and the need for policing in our communities in the first place. So how do we do that? Well, there are better ways to address some of the challenges that we see in community versus than sending a police officer out there to deal with it. I'll give you some examples. I think community conflict resolution centers are much better ways to sort through conflict and resolution than police officers showing up to already heightened situations with guns, tasers, and other things that oftentimes escalate situations in our community and not de-escalate them. I think it's a much better alternative to work to get folks who are in underground economies like selling drugs on our streets to get them involved in legalized cannabis industries, which we know is very much something that's happening already in Georgia. We don't see a lot of people of color in that industry, and we need to do a better job of incorporating and bringing young people who are shown an interest in cannabis to be in the legal side of it as well. We know that a much better alternative for dealing with homelessness is not sending people to jail, which is what we built the Atlanta City Detention Center for. In 1996, it was the first Olympics facility that was built because we didn't have a plan on how we were going to address the needs of unsheltered people. We know that a much better alternative for that is actually addressing the needs of unsheltered people rather than criminalizing them. So we know that there are much better alternatives to addressing some of the things that we rely on the police to do right now. And so we just need to be pushing our elected officials to be more bold champions of those alternatives. So that way we aren't handcuffed and tied to these broken forms of public safety that aren't making people feel more safe. I think we cannot ignore the fact that we spend so much millions of dollars on policing and people are still saying they don't feel safe. People in my community of Bankhead have said that they haven't felt safe for years. Now people, in other areas of the city are getting attention because of a few high profile incidents. But what about communities who have been plagued with substance abuse issues and mental health challenges and a lack of investment for years? We have to also recognize that there is a very clear connection between the fact that the city of Atlanta is the #1 city in the country for income disparities in the country. And we cannot separate that from the fact that we are seeing a rise in crime and some public safety issues right now. And it's really the chickens that are coming home to roost. And it's showing us that this lack of investment, similar to the pandemic, how we continue to allow this lack of investment and this lack of being serious about ending these systemic inequities that persist throughout our communities are creating situations where none of us are safe.
Right, excellent points, thank you. And your audio was working a lot better with the camera off. If it starts having more technical difficulties again, I've been asked to ask you to drop off and come back on if it happens. But I have a follow-up question for you because you just said a lot of good stuff there. And something that I noticed as so Atlanta and Georgia, we were, in the national spotlight for the US Senate runoffs, the races with Ossoff and Warnock. We flipped those seats blue. In that time, defunding the police still became this sort of like political hot potato where each party was passing it back and forth, basically like, no, not it. At one point, Raphael Warnock accused Kelly Loeffler of wanting to defund the police. So how did we get to a place where defunding police, which is, really the beginning to pave a pathway to protect our communities, to build and reimagine a much better world? Devin, how do you think that happened in the political schemes between the Republican and the Democrats in both the presidential and the Senate races?
Well, one is because, Republicans got played. Republicans got played by Donald Trump in the sense that we thought that Trump was the party of, or was the president and the champion of the police. But we see that white supremacists and insurrectionists invaded the Capitol on January 6th and assaulted who? The police with Blue Lives Matter flags. And so when we reverse back to prior to all of that, what this really was a response to was that Black Lives Matter, because of what was happening in the movement for Black Lives, because of what had happened to George Floyd, what had happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what had happened to Breonna Taylor, and what had happened to so many other Black folks, at the same time as a global pandemic that is impacting Black people and brown people disproportionately, are now recognizing and seeing that we don't see the investment in our communities in the ways that we need to see it. We see that we continue to be gunned down in our communities in ways that are very blatant and apparent. And so what it really was for the political right to hijack that and say, well, these demands are radical. She kept trying to label Senator Warnock as a radical Raphael Warnock, which really was dog whistle politics for a whole bunch of racist undertones as far as that campaign was moving forward and how they were trying to paint the senator. And so I think where it became this issue is that as always with these issues around police brutality, is that there are still national polling that shows that Black communities want to be safe in our communities, obviously, and that many folks, because we have not been exposed to other tactics and strategies that can keep our communities safe, feel like the only way to keep our communities safe is to have this very precarious situation and relationship with law enforcement. And so because of that, they felt as though Republicans made this miscalculation, I think, to some respect, because Senator Warnock and Ossoff were successful. But they wanted to make this, to drive a wedge in between Black communities and Black voters to make them feel like, well, if you're supporting these folks, these are going to be people who are going to take money away from the police and you won't be safe in your communities. But what they didn't realize is that we also have a much more nuanced relationship with public safety in our communities, and that we were able to see the forest from the trees. And so I think it was a miscalculation of, one, we didn't do a good job of defining what it meant to defund the police from the onset. And so I think conservatives took that opportunity to define it for us, and we were responding to what it meant to defund the police rather than leading and saying, this is what it means to defund the police. And I think we have to be honest about that as movement. That's not a bad thing. It was just a missed opportunity, and we can learn from that.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome points. Alex, now, so to tie it back up to a national level, because around the same time with the elections last year, Obama comes out and says, like, don't go too far left, and is kind of painting this radical picture on defunding police. How do we end up with these reform narratives? And if this turns into a broader discussion around neoliberalism, I'm fine with that. Just let it go where it needs to. But yeah, why don't you take that?
So, I'm totally in agreement with what Devin said. I'll just add a few things, right? The movement wasn't focused on the national election. I mean, people were concerned about the national election, but the movement to transform public safety at the local level was not spending a lot of time talking about the presidential race, was my pretty clear sense. And I was, in 25 cities a year up until COVID, and many more after, because we could do things virtually. People were really focused at the local level. And it was only because of the intensity of the protests that it all of a sudden got catapulted onto the front pages and became a national issue. And we hadn't done the groundwork to have that conversation in this abstract media environment, where we get very short shrift. If you look at the cities that have had real victories in the last year, these are cities where the organizing had been going on for years, like Oakland, like Los Angeles, like Austin, like Portland, like Atlanta in some ways, right, with the closing of the jail, in St. Louis. In cities like New York, where that organizing around alternatives to policing had not really been happening, nothing substantial was won. And so the point here is that we win when we have time to have real movements in communities to talk about what these alternatives to policing could look like. Because as exactly as Devin pointed out, right, for generations, people have been told the only tool you can have for public safety is more police, longer prison sentences, more programs run through the criminal legal system. And so if we've not had a chance to have real conversations with people, when they hear defund the police, what they hear is, you want to take away the one thing we've been told we can have. And if that's the extent of the conversation, that's not a winner for us. And that's what the Republicans were trying to capitalize on, was to turn people who had not had those conversations against the movement in this abstract conversation. And that's why it's so essential that we keep having these on-the-ground conversations. And as to this bigger point about, well, why is it in progressive cities with Democratic mayors like Atlanta, like Detroit, like New York, why is it that it's such a massive struggle to take one dime from the police department and put it back into communities? And I think we have to ask some tough questions about what it means to be a Democrat in these big cities in this day and age. And I think what it means is a capitulation to the idea that all cities can do is to subsidize and support the already most successful economic actors in hopes that they can be competitive on the global stage. So cities put all their resources into their downtown development deals, into tax breaks for the rich, into deregulating big corporations in hopes that those corporations will get so wealthy that some of it will trickle down to the rest of us. And this has been the bipartisan politics of the United States for the last 40, 50 years. We sometimes call it neoliberalism, free trade, things like that. But what it means is that cities have to cut services in order to provide all these subsidies to the rich, and the trickle down is not happening. Instead, we're getting mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass involvement in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods because people don't have access to formal jobs that pay a decent wage. And then these Democratic mayors, rather than trying to actually address those problems, turn them over to police to manage. Not to solve, right? Police can't solve homelessness. They can't fix the schools. They can't solve people's substance abuse problems. They just put a lid on it so that the city can keep pursuing its downtown development deals. And then when the police engage in racist practices, kill people, or, abusive, these same political leaders say, oh, don't worry, we'll fix that with some implicit bias training and body cameras, and we'll create a community policing program. But none of that changes the underlying reality, which is that they're using police to solve social problems that they themselves have helped create through their economic policies. And as long as they're committed to those economic policies, they're going to be committed to policing, because policing is what makes possible their little insider deals with their corporate buddies.
Right. And with all that being said, I want to direct us to, you mentioned local city responses, particularly you mentioned Democratic cities. Atlanta is one under Democratic city leadership. I do, before we expand on exactly what the city of Atlanta's responses were to our protests, which were Atlanta's largest protest in history, the longest running and the largest protest, and we're the breeding ground of the civil rights movement. It's a big deal. But I want to turn towards the shootings that happened in Atlanta last week. We're living in a society right now where there were 7 shootings in 7 days in America. One of them was in Atlanta. An armed white man was able to travel between 2 different counties to 3 different spas and kill 8 people. 6 of them were Asian women. Our media has struggled to call it a white supremacist attack. They haven't been able to do it. But our media was able to quickly credit the police for their surveillance programs and capturing this person. But Devin, you said something on the floor in regards to House Bill 286, and I have a quote from what you said in your opposition to that bill. And you said, if Georgia is already spending $8.3 billion on police, prisons, and jails, and we are not already safe, something is wrong. That means we need to reimagine public safety. And what we are doing is a definition of insanity. So can you expand on that and how you think tragedies like the one last week and all these shootings are somehow being funneled? And Alex, I think you could speak on this as well. How tragedies and events like this are somehow funneled up to embolden arguments for expanding police powers. Devin, why don't you go first?
Yeah, as you are saying that, I'm watching the footage of State Representative Park Cannon's arrest. And ironically enough, she was arrested by the same agency that arrested the white supremacists who killed 6 Asian women, the Highway Patrol. And what I think about is, yet again, the response that we saw, which was that this was not some success on the part of law enforcement. This man was able to go to multiple jurisdictions, kill numerous people, and make it almost to South Georgia before he was apprehended. Now, how many Black people are able to do something a fraction as heinous as what this white supremacist was able to do and get away with it? And so we have to, one, recognize that to some extent, that the posture of law enforcement towards some of the most heinous acts against this country, some of the most heinous acts of racism, that the posture of law enforcement is oftentimes very casual. We saw Dylan Roof was able to blow away numerous Black people in a Black church in South Carolina, and the police took him for Burger King and, a soda. And so we have to recognize that, the Atlanta Police Department has put numerous resources, helicopters, surveillance into tracking down street racers. But where was the resources and the surveillance and the aggression to make sure that white supremacists aren't blowing away people in our streets? And so that is yet again where we see the inability of law enforcement to keep our communities safe, because the ways in which we deal with these things is to get to the root cause of it. We continue to just slap a Band-Aid onto all of these things. We slap Band-Aids onto mental health. We slap Band-Aids onto gun violence. We slap Band-Aids onto, drug addiction, all of these things that keep our communities in peril. And we use the police as a quick, reactionary response, but there is no systemic change that occurs when we continue to double down in police funding. And so when I said it was the definition of insanity, is that it is insane to continue to invest the same amount of money year or more, year after year after year, and people year after year after year continue to say that they don't feel safe. So obviously one hand is not speaking to the other. And I'm tired of going to the state capitol, going to city hall, going to county government, and colluding with my own oppression. I want to deal with the root causes of what cause our communities to be unsafe, to change the material conditions that our people are living in, to create wealth building opportunity, housing is truly affordable, to make sure that education is fully funded, to make sure that people have access to healthcare, to make sure that we actually right the wrongs of the past, and that we as a city are serious about passing a reparations package in the city of Atlanta. Those are the things that are going to get to the root causes of what causes our communities to be unsafe and to be unwelcoming and to be a place where there oftentimes isn't an opportunity for people who look like me. And as I continue to see people who look like me in leadership, and also people who don't look like me in leadership at the state and the city level, continue to invest my money, my neighbor's money, into our own oppression, it is insanity to me. A thing. And we've got to be clear that we either are all going to get through this thing together, or we are all going to perish together, but we will be together. And folks got to recognize that if you live in Buckhead, your vitality of your community depends on the vitality of mine. And we cannot continue to assume and continue to take this posture that the police are going to answer and address all of these questions and these concerns that we have in our community. And so that is why I told state senators in that committee that the decision to pass this legislation, House Bill 286, and the decisions that they make to double down on police funding and prison funding and jail funding is literally the definition of insanity. And we continue to see our communities pay a price for it. And I'm tired of it. Mm-hmm. I'm sick of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Alex,
yeah, I'm sick of it too. I'm with you. I'm sick of it too. Let me try to do this through a slightly different lens to help maybe make the point through a little bit of an analogy. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we radically defunded mental health services and affordable housing. This was a decision that was made to shift resources from those who were most in need to give tax breaks to the rich. And as a result of that, the population of folks who were unhoused, who are having major unaddressed mental health challenges has exploded. Right? We didn't have mass homelessness in the 60s and 70s. It was a result of explicit political decision-making in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that produced this massive social problem. And then when a very small fraction of this population does something terrible, harmful, pushes someone in front of a car, stabs someone in a parking lot, goes on a rampage of some kind, we're told, aha, see, homeless people are dangerous. The people having a mental health crisis are horribly dangerous. And so we need a massive system of policing to manage this dangerous population. And then that justifies framing the problem of homelessness and mental health challenges as problems of crime to be addressed by policing. And this is perfect because what accountability then starts to look like is arresting that homeless person and bringing them to court and incarcerating them. But where's the accountability for the elected officials who created this mess? Where's the accountability for the decision to leave our fellow human beings out on the street with no support? The decision to turn it into a crime problem is precisely about obscuring and hiding the fact that it's the politicians who should be held responsible for creating this mess and for letting the situation get so out of control that there seems to be this need for an immediate armed police response. And the same is true with the kinds of these mass shootings, which sometimes are directly tied to the evisceration of any kind of mental health infrastructure. But also, what about the political culpability for white supremacists, demagoguery? Look at what happened at the Capitol. Everyone's talking about, well, we need to arrest the insurrectionists and hold them accountable, give the FBI more money, triple the size of the Capitol Police, create new anti-terrorism laws, right? But where's the accountability for Ted Cruz, who went around promoting these ideas, supporting these movements, raising millions of dollars from the NRA and billionaires to go around promoting these ideas? Where's the accountability for Amazon and Walmart, who are giving money to these politicians who support QAnon and these crazy conspiracy theories and going around today still saying that Trump should be president and that he really won the election? Where's the accountability for that?
And that's one of the reasons why the argument around defunding the police does resonate with lots of folks, particularly in the Black community, because we know that the police pick and choose what they want to be concerned about. Okay, we all saw the video footage of Capitol police officers while some of their own colleagues were being bashed upside the head, were being called the N-word, everything other than a child of God, while some of those same police officers allowed insurrectionists to literally walk through the front gates of the Capitol so that they could go in and try and overthrow a lawful election, right? We also see that where is the arrest warrant for President Trump, and for inciting a riot? Where is the arrest warrants for so many of these elected leaders who have lied to the public, who had tried to sway elections, right? Who tried to rig elections? Where are the arrest warrants? And so that is why oftentimes when people are saying, well, what is all this around not trusting the police? Well, it's very clear for Black folks. We see that there are so many bad actors where the police turn a blind eye. But Rayshard Brooks was asleep in a Wendy's drive-thru and paid the ultimate price with his life. And so that is why when we continue to see where people are like, no, we want to do something different from the police, it is birthed out of that. It is birthed out of the fact that I, as a Black person, recognize that I get a different interaction with the criminal legal system than someone like Alex and others in the same communities that I'm a part of, that their experience can be completely different. And that oftentimes the people who are engaging in the most egregious, harmful activities see no legal recourses and don't see the ugly sides of the criminal legal system. I think about it, how there are so many struggling folks who are in jail for financial crimes, writing a bad check, $500-600. Where is the handcuffs for the folks, the executives at Wells Fargo's that opened up accounts in people's names without permission? That is fraud. I know there are several Black women who are sitting in jail for that right now. No one at Wells Fargo is in jail. And so goes beyond the police, because remember, the police are just a tool of the broader criminal legal system, right? And so it is a reimagining of public safety, but it's a reimagining of what accountability, right, and justice looks like in this country, because we have to recognize that justice in this country is not blind. Oh, it most certainly sees color. And we see that in the incarceration rates. We see that in the weights of how court cases shake out for Black folks versus how they shake out for other people. And we just got to be real about that. And we've got to stop playing these games like this is something. We don't need a million different surveys and reports to tell us what we already know, that the criminal legal system is not a system where Black people and brown people and people who are other see justice. And that's just the reality of the situation. If there are elected officials at any level of government that is not able to admit that, they are dangerous. They are dangerous, because then that means that this politicized moment that we are in, this continued fascism that we see permeating at all levels of government, will continue to move forward and advance. And that means a very bleak future for us if we allow that.
Right. Thank you. So Devin, I want to talk more about what happened in Atlanta following not just the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Rayshard Brooks lost his life at the hands of APD on the night of June 12th, less than a month after our protest had started. One of my, favorite moments of learning more about you is you and other protesters were blocking Keisha Lance Bottoms, our mayor, from leaving City Hall. I want to talk about her for a minute. And her seat is up this year, along with everyone else in city council and other local elections. How do you feel about Keisha's response to the protests and to the cries of thousands of Atlanta residents for defunding police and quote unquote reform of our police systems?
You know, I'm not going to let the mayor off the hook, but I also am not going to let city council off the hook either. It's all of them. You know, there are council members that had the courage to vote for the Rayshard Brooks bill. I would have liked to see the mayor champion that more, but ultimately, you know, it didn't even get an opportunity to be vetoed by her because council decided not to pass that legislation. And oftentimes what happens is that the mayor, we look solely to the mayor as the person to address the public safety issues. But I look to people like Dustin Hillis, who is the chair of the Public Safety Committee, who wants to talk about, making sure that Atlanta is safe. But under your watch, we saw police officers gun down folks with no accountability. We saw a system that was not even offered with some tangible reforms that came from city council. Anything that was halfway kind of sort of decent came from the mayor's office. And so what I see is a lack of leadership, and I see dinosaurs at city council trying to lead us into the future. And we're going to go the way of the dinosaur if we follow them. And so I'm very clear that it is the mayor, but it is also city council. It is the city council president. It is anyone who is trying to hold up the closure of the Atlanta City Detention Center, which, by the way, I will say the mayor, that is something that the mayor has championed. I would like to see her take some more forceful leadership on that, but we're seeing obstructionists on city council, people, bad actors like Michael Julian Bond, who continue to try and erode the advancements that we have made as far as ending cash bail in the city of Atlanta, who continues to try to get the closure and the reimagining of the Atlanta City Detention Center off track and have it leased over to Fulton County so that they can expand the scope of our jail system. If we allow Fulton County, for example, to purchase the City of Atlanta Detention Center, we would have one of the largest jails in the country and definitely one of the largest jails in the Southeast. How does that compute in the same city that's too busy to hate? How does that compute in the same city that is the cradle of the civil rights movement? We have an identity crisis in Atlanta, and we got to decide what city we want to be. because we can't have a city where our mayor is named Keisha, but we're seeing Karen-like politics coming from the mayor's office. And we can't have a city council that says that champions of it being the cradle of the civil rights movement, and we see some of the most regressive policies that a city council could offer as it pertains to the reimagining of public safety. So for me, as a frustrated resident of Atlanta, I don't put all of my frustration at the feet of the mayor. City council most certainly has a role to play in that, because ultimately policy is made by the city council. They are the legislative body. And as a legislative body, they have failed, in my opinion, on their responsibility of keeping Atlanta residents safe, because we have not seen real reforms and, not reforms, but real policies that is dedicated to, ending the income disparities that exist in our city, where we're the top city for income disparities in the country. And that cannot be uncoupled from the fact that we have public safety challenges in our community. The two are most certainly interlinked, and I have not seen leadership from city council that I would be proud of.
Yeah, and to echo some of what you shared, and before I kick it back to Alex, just to expand more specifics on the city of Atlanta's response, as someone who was reporting and was all up in city council last summer to observe their response to it, we saw an expansion of police powers. We saw an increase in the police budget. We saw police officers receive a $500 bonus from the Atlanta Police Foundation after Rayshard Brooks was killed, and they did what was called the blue flu of calling out. We saw a veto of the 8 Can't Wait legislation for Keisha, and to highlight a little more on what happened with the Rayshard Brooks bill. It was an email sent from the mayor's office instructing city council members to tank the bill the same night that it was up for a vote. And then I also remember the crackdown on the water boys legislation that essentially criminalized a group that is demographically young Black men and boys selling water during the summer. Which doesn't look unique from something like Governor Brian Kemp's anti-gang activity bill, which died in the House last legislative session, but it's still hanging on in legislation. So, Alex, I want to ask you, is this type of city ordinance behavior where city governments will claim reform, but will essentially sabotage movements from on-the-ground activists for actual tangible reforms? Is that historical?
Yes, because look, these local city council members need the police to manage all these social problems they've created. And then when that policing causes blowback, what they say is, well, let's reform the police. But what they mean is, let's try to get the community to feel better about the police so they'll quit complaining, so the police can continue on with the war on drugs and the war on gangs and the war on crime and all the rest. And this is the key thing, right? When you hear reimagining policing or reforming policing, what you should hear is more money for police and no change to what police really do. And what the movement is demanding is a rejection of that, and is saying, no, the metric of change here is reimagining public safety by investing in strategies that aren't rooted in control, coercion, violence, and all the rest. That it's about lifting people up. It's about building up communities. And the problem, right, with these elected officials is that they don't want to do that. They don't actually want to build up these communities in these broad ways that will really solve these problems, because that will interfere with the agendas of the people who write them campaign checks. I mean, people got to look at where the money is coming from. The overwhelming contributors to local political races across the country are real estate interests. And they've got their own idea about what public safety is and the role of police in producing that. They got an interest in gentrification. They got an interest in their downtown real estate deals, and police are essential to that agenda. And so they will plow money into a district race in a poor community to make sure they've got that vote tied up so that it doesn't interfere with that larger agenda. And so what we need are elected officials who are going to reject that game. And we're starting to see that in places, right? Again, if you look at the cities that made real changes in the last year, that really reduced police spending, that really made new investments, it's because there were 1 or 2 or 3 fairly new city council members who were elected on an explicit rejection of that politics, a rejection of austerity politics, a rejection of pro-policing politics, because the mainstream of the Democratic Party is in love with the police because it makes possible all their deals. So we need a real reckoning within the Democratic Party about what it really stands for. And we have some real choices out there now in a way that we didn't a generation ago to the same degree. We've got a whole generation of young people running for public office on an explicit rejection of that politics. And I think that what we need to find is a convergence of the community-based organizing to make these new public safety strategies real for people and embodying that through the electoral process at the local level so that we can have the power to really implement these changes.
Yes. I don't know if I'm breaking news here. Shameless plug. I am running for Atlanta City Council District 9. Before that very same reason, because the council member in my district it did vote against the Rayshard Brooks bill, which was an opportunity for us to really have a conversation and a real mechanism to reimagine public safety here in the city of Atlanta. And yes, we need to be able to support organizers like myself. I'm not the only one. There are people who are running in other districts across the city and across the country who need to be elevated, who need to be supported, because it's really clear that the current status quo on our city council are trying to take us the way of the dinosaur. And I don't want to go that way. I want a couple more generations. I want a few more years. And all of these issues are interconnected. As Alex, as you talked about, you know, there was an article that came out last year around how one of the police officer, a former police officer in Atlanta, made it clear that the role of the police in moving forward resident displacement and gentrification in the city of Atlanta, and how they were working in partnership with corporate developers to push Black and brown people outside of the city of Atlanta. That's on record. We know that that is the truth, but we also see that codified in public policy. And so we've got to get real about what is really keeping our communities held back. And the fact of the matter is that we continue to collude with our own oppression and put Band-Aids on these bullet wounds of a lack of investment, or when we do invest in Black communities, it not being done in a way that's equitable and that actually leaves wealth there for generations to come, because wealth is the number one opportunity and number, I believe, that can create more safety in our communities. In communities where you don't see a lot of wealth, you oftentimes see a lot of people who are in unsafe conditions. And we got to get real about that. I know my community in Bankhead is ground zero for that.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, you've spoken about the importance of local on the ground efforts and activists to like really see real change through. Do you have any words of advice for, you know, organizers on the ground in Atlanta with the challenges that we face that we've discussed in this panel? Any words of advice or any insights to share?
Yeah, I think that we need to find a balance or a productive relationship between on the street protest, which is essential, which is how we got to where we are, and the hard work of talking to people that we don't already know about these important issues to build out the movement. These things have to work together, because protest by itself is not going to be enough to convince our neighbors that we have the ideas that are going to address their concerns. That requires us having real, like, neighborhood conversations, bringing people in to talk at length about what we could do differently. And you can't communicate that at a protest, and the media is not going to communicate it for you. So we need the street protest to create the political space and to get the attention, but then we need the grassroots, retail, door-to-door talking to people, standing on street corners, holding a clipboard at the shopping mall, having meetings at people's houses, at community centers, where we can lay this out, right? That we can bring in folks who've been directly affected. We can bring in people who have maybe some expertise to share from other places, from what the research shows. These people have to work together. And I think that's the challenge, as we hopefully can see the light at the end of the tunnel on COVID, that our ability to have people over, to gather in space together will increase, and so that we'll be able to advance this conversation.
Thank you. You mentioned the media, and I want to tie us back to our first question about the myth of policing and how that's been perpetuated through American culture and our understanding of police. And I'm not going to do maybe a shameless plug, I don't know, but I run a local magazine in Atlanta called The Mainline that we've been around for coming up on 2 years now. I listened to the Columbia Journalism Review that I mentioned I heard you on kind of religiously, because I believe in building and creating healthier information ecosystems. I believe that the media is a big component as to how we view certain things, and is essentially the status quo of media, mainstream media, is to uphold a white power structure. Alex and Devin, both of you, I think, can speak to this, but how important is the role of journalism, specifically local journalism, in these conversations? And how can outlets like myself, or journalists like myself who are up against a lot, we have a former President Obama saying, don't go too far left. Like, how can we combat that and take the narrative back and put it in the right lens of history of all this truth that you were sharing in this panel today?
Well, I'll maybe just start and say that, we have to understand the media is not one thing, that increasingly it is a fragmented, decentralized set of institutions, and that we have to make strategic decisions about who we want to talk to, how we want to talk to them, who are our potential allies in this movement. And I find it's essential that we build relationships with journalists who are willing to tell our story in a way that helps advance the movement. That's honest, that has journalistic integrity, but cares about someone other than what the police spokesman has to say about an issue, or what the mayor has to say about an issue, that actually cares what people in the community have to say about an issue. And then we have to work hard to package our messaging in a way that will resonate to a broader public that can't be in the same room with us when we have these in-depth conversations.
Thank you. Devin?
Yeah, I think it is the media being clear, journalists being clear about what's not being talked about, right? I think there are so many stories that I know there are so many stories that the local Atlanta media press gauntlet ignores, either because they're understaffed or because they are intentionally ignoring it, or a combination of those things, or some other factors, like the fact that local journalism around the country is suffering. I feel like I remember when creative loafing was around, there was a little bit more nuance around how we talked about law enforcement. I know that I learned a lot about the Red Dog unit and things like that, as far as like some of the really ugly practices of APD from local journalists. I didn't find that out from CNN or some other national outlet. And so I think it's really important that local journalists see what's not being talked about. What is the aspect of the story that's not being covered? Are we just allowing the police to define what how we talk about public safety and what is public safety and what's not public safety. Where is the community perspective and who is community? Are we just hearing from the folks that we always hear from, or are we hearing from people in community who are actually living these experiences every day? I think it's important for journalists to really do their journalistic duty and to go far and ask the tough questions, and to not just look at that, ooh, that's that shiny thing over there that the mayor is talking about. Actually, like, that's a red herring. We need to be looking at this thing right here. And shaking down trees. You know, I miss the days where journalists, you know, really got in people's faces about, you know, real issues, not, you know, these cancel culture. We're talking as U.S. senators about cancel culture. Why do we care about what Ted Cruz has to say about cancel culture? No, what do you have to say about immigration policy? What do you have to say about, you know, the reimagining of the criminal legal system? What do you have to say about economic policy that centers the lives of people who have been historically marginalized and disenfranchised in this country? We're asking powerful people the wrong questions. And so I really just want us to get back to getting into the bread and butter of public policy, because we allow so many political neophytes and people who don't have the lived experiences of the communities that they're seeking to represent to weasel their ways into these seats, because we don't ask them the real questions about real public policy.
Mm-hmm. And I could talk unscripted about the reforms and revelations we need to have in our media systems, but I'm not going to do that to everyone tuning into the panel.
That's a whole other panel.
Maybe we could do another panel. I want you to know that myself and everyone at the Mainline really takes it to heart. There are conversations happening. We are trying to figure out how to hold certain media systems and actors in media accountable for basically disavowing their vow to tell the truth and serve our communities, not ratings and not politicians and not corporations, right? So with that, thank you for giving me the space to talk about my field in this conversation. Is there anything, before we wrap up our time together today, is there anything else that you want to have the space to talk about? Devin, I know that, you know, this legislative session has been like, I don't even have the words for it. I'm exhausted. I'm sure you are too. Can I ask you, because I think a lot of people are experiencing this, how are you coping with burnout and stress and fatigue and exhaustion from this like relentless system? Like, one example, House Bill 531 came through, and then like they snuck language from that bill to SB 202, and like, you wake up and it's like, oh, there's 3 more trashy bills going on that are going to affect people. Either one of you, Alex, you've been in this work for a long time too. How do you cope with these things?
Well, I'm going to let Alex take that question first, because, you know, no shade, Alex, but you're a little bit older than me. So I'll let wisdom, speak to this. Please tell us.
I have been in this work for a long time. I won't say exactly how long, but I was, you know, involved in anti-nuclear organizing in the 1980s, and educational access issues in the 1980s. Well, I don't think there's one strategy for everyone. I think also we have to give ourselves a little bit of a break. Any movement that can't survive without me for an afternoon isn't a movement that's going to win what we need to win. Right? Any movement that needs me to be working 24 hours a day is not up to the task yet. Right? So we got to let ourselves off the hook and create space this has to be sustainable. And while we're in crisis mode all the time, and the emotions that we feel are so powerful, and our desire to want to stop the violence right now is so real. But if we don't build a life around this, then we'll burn out. And I've, of course, seen a lifetime of that, of people who thought they couldn't live if they didn't fix everything tomorrow, and we can't fix everything tomorrow. The other thing, I'll just say one other thing, is that we have to quit thinking that politics is something that other people do or something that we do at the ballot box every 4 years. Politics is something that we all have to do, even when it is boring and irritating and a nuisance. You know, we still have to go to that meeting. We have to be part of a process. We have to hold the people in the movement accountable by showing up. But we have to do it in a way that's sustainable for us as individuals. And we have to, you know, we have to relate to people in the movement from a position of care and compassion, not competition and control, you know, so that we have to create a movement that's inviting, that's not self-righteous, that's not trying to one-up everyone, because that's destructive for us as individuals and it's destructive for the movement.
All right, y'all. Y'all can pass around the collection plate because Professor, Bishop, Pastor Alex, that was a great benediction. Having been raised in the Black church, you know, I love a good word, and that'll preach. No, I think that was beautiful. Yes, like all of the things, it has to be sustainable. If the movement can exist with me for an afternoon or a week, we really got to question whether or not our movement is as strong as we believe it is. But I believe that our movement is that strong. And so the ways that I have been taking care of myself, oh, my sound again, Lord. The way that I've been taking care of myself is I spend a lot of time with my dog. He doesn't know anything about police brutality or all of the challenges in the world. He's just a beautiful poodle who wants to be hugged and loved all the time. And so that is my version of self-care. You know, definitely being kind to myself and recognizing that I have this thing that I trust that if I do my part, that even if I don't know the other person, somebody out there is doing theirs. And so that is what keeps me sane. That's what keeps me going, is that I don't have to do all of it. I just have to do my piece of it. And if I do my piece of it well, that energy, those vibrations will be sent across the world to organizers and freedom fighters who have been doing this work for forever. And our ancestors will sustain us and they will continue to keep us joyful and grounded in love and peace and compassion while we use our fiery outrage to bring about the change that we need to within this lifetime. I'm not doing this for the next lifetime. I'm doing it for this lifetime because I believe that liberation can be achieved in this lifetime. But I just do it piece by piece, brick by brick, and with the understanding that I don't have to do all of it. I just got to do my part.
Awesome. Thank you both for saying all that. I think that our communities in Atlanta, especially right now, needed to hear those words. And just one last piece, for something that's helped me get through it is remembering that predatory capitalism and white supremacy wants to steal my humanness, which includes like basic feelings like joy and empathy and compassion. So I have to come to this work repeatedly from that place. And like Alex was saying, not from a place of, you know, self-righteousness or hatred or being anti anything. It comes from a place of love. So thank you so much for being here and spending time with us to talk about all of this. It was so great. I hope that some folks feel energized even after this like hellish couple months that we've had in Georgia. Thank you both for being here. Folks, if you enjoyed this panel, please check out DARK, Defund APD, Refund Communities. You can join the movement at darkatl.com. I can attest they're doing amazing work. I love that there's a Defund APD org in Atlanta. That is so dope. I love it. So check it out and follow them on Instagram and Twitter. And Alex and Devin, thank you so much for being here.
Love to everybody.